What is going on, ProGuides family? It is your host, Sergeant Frost, and today we'll be covering how and when to use the Phantom. We'll be telling you all about what makes the Phantom so great, why you should use it over other guns, and also what maps it's best on, as well as why. We'll make sure you know which gun to go for in each situation. And finally, we'll wrap things up with some great tips in order to boost your Phantom play to the next level. So without further ado, like and subscribe and let's get right into it. So before anything, let's have a quick overview of this gun. The Phantom costs a whopping 2,900 credits, but in return you do get an S-tier rifle that shares its top spot with the Vandal counterpart that's identically priced. However, the Phantom is superior in a couple of ways. For one, it has a faster fire rate at around 11 rounds per second versus the Vandal's 9.75, and it's also a more accurate gun with less spread. On top of that, the Phantom has a suppressor and thus is quieter, and it has no tracers, but also 5 more bullets with a clip size of 30. Of course, the Phantom is not just plain better though, since the Phantom does suffer from one big weakness, damage falloff, which makes the gun less viable at longer ranges. This means that with the Phantom, you're going to have to be a bit more picky with the fights you're going to take, as if you just take them willy-nilly, you might run into a bad situation. Long story short, the Phantom is clearly superior at close range, but whenever the damage falloff kicks in, it starts to become a bit more debatable, and eventually at long range, well, the Vandal definitely has an advantage. This means that whenever you plan on taking close fights, the Phantom is usually the answer, and the longer the range, the more crucial the Vandal becomes. This makes the Phantom a lot better on defense, as you at least for the most part get to decide what kind of fight you take. No matter whether you decide to peek aggressively or hold an angle close, you already know the max distance that enemies will be able to fight you from, as they after all need to push into you eventually. So also, what side you're on is something to consider when you're choosing between the guns. But of course, something that you'll need for both guns is to have solid fundamentals and good positioning. So if you're trying to build up your skill set to take over the rank ladder, don't forget to visit our website ProGuides.com, where our Radiant and Immortal level coaches are more than happy to help you become a player of your dreams. Just click the link in the description if you're interested, and let's keep going. Essentially, in order to answer the Phantom or the Vandal, first you must ask yourself, where am I headed? What fights do I plan on taking? What side am I on? But also, what's the map? We're going to go a bit more in depth with that last question in a second. But before we do that, let's quickly go over our question of the day first. Today's question being, what gun do you prefer using, the Phantom or the Vandal? For me personally, I'm someone that likes to tap fire a lot, so I have to give this one over to the Vandal. The Vandal having a one-shot headshot at all ranges just saves my life too many times that I can't even count it. And with that being said, I really just have to hand it over to this gun. Don't get me wrong, I really love using the Phantom from time to time, especially on smaller maps like Split. But on a personal level, me and the Vandal just vibe on a different wavelength. Let us know what your answer is in the comment section down below. Now, let's get right back into the video. Alright, so let's get started on the topic of maps. To give you a very quick outline, the Phantom is best suited for Split and Bind. It's generally pretty good on maps like Ascent, Fracture, and also Haven, but it is not very good on maps like Icebox and especially Breeze. But of course, we can go a little bit more in depth as to why, and also the situational uses, where you might want to stray away from it anyway. So on Bind, you almost always want a Phantom, since almost every fight you're going to take there is going to be close to medium distance. Because of this, using a Phantom on defense is pretty much a no-brainer, and also on attack, it's not something to really think too much about. However, there are a few spots or fights that come into mind that a Vandal is definitely better suited for. That is, if you're going to be fighting the long beat of fountain angle, whether you're on attack or defense, although if you're defending, you probably want to AWP that, and also if you want to take the B guard into back sight or cubby fight, as that again is fairly long range. Additionally, if you're going A short and you're concerned somehow you might be AWPing on Heaven, and it can't or won't be smoked, the Vandal again is preferred. And lastly, if you plan on taking the teleporter bath fight, as again it's long range and commonly AWPed. Essentially, for all these angles you kind of need an AWP or a Vandal as an attacker, as you're expecting an AWP to hold it. And in order to even have a small chance of killing them, you're going to need that clean one-tap headshot. On Split, essentially the same thing applies. The only long-range duels that come to mind are the A main to screens and A ramp to A heaven. But for the most part, everything is pretty much Phantom range. Split might be the single best map for Phantoms, and I honestly don't think you'll ever buy a Vandal there, unless you're attacking and planning on fighting one of these two angles specifically. For Ascent, we have Mid, where you need to have a Vandal no doubt, but then again, fighting mid as an attacker is pretty sus, as you're going to be versing a lot of AWPs, and the angles are very, very long. As a defender, fighting with the Vandal is also not amazing, as again, operators. But also, the angles you can hold aren't very great, unless you opt for a cool off angle. But then again, while holding off angles, having that suppressor might just be the difference maker on whether you kill one or two players, so even then it's pretty debatable. For everywhere else on the map though, so aside from mid, Phantoms all day long. The sights don't have particularly long sight lines, and also the post plant fights are very close range. Essentially, see what I did there? Unless you plan on dying to AWPs, you should probably take a Phantom. Personally though, I love ego-challenging AWPs than dying, so the Vandal is commonly my go-to pick. On Haven, the question of Vandal vs Phantom is very similar. If you want to fight AWPs with a Vandal and probably die, you can take it C long or long A as an attacker, as both are excellent places to try to test your ego. Although peeking from A sewers into A garden and A lobby as a defender is probably a pretty good example of where you'd probably prefer to take a Vandal over a Phantom. In fact, if you're planning to push as a defender, having a Vandal is probably pretty logical. Peeking garage into window is a pretty Vandal-sided fight. Walking down mid trying to catch people around the box, same thing applies. But also, if you want to push long C, having a Vandal is preferred. Fracture is probably the most interesting of the maps, as either gun really is acceptable. If you're going dish or arcade, you probably prefer a Phantom, but going either A or B main means a Vandal might be in the cards. And on top of that, any fights in either attacker or defender spawn are also better for Vandals. On defense also there's a lot of variance, and whether you pick up a Vandal or a Phantom depends entirely on the angle you plan on playing. Honestly, we could fill an entire video talking about all the different angles on Fracture and how they either require a Vandal or a Phantom, but unfortunately there's only so much time. So instead, try and put together the knowledge you've gained from all the other maps and come up with a decision yourself. After all, setting up the decision framework is probably pretty beneficial anyways. For Icebox and Breeze, well, the Phantom is not great. The maps are pretty big and most of the fights you take are quite long range. There are some pretty specific scenarios where a Phantom might be better still, like when you're playing inside of a Viper ultimate. But for the most part, you're going to be better off using a Vandal. Now that we've covered that, let's get into some pretty gun-specific tips for the Phantom. First of all, know that the Phantom is pretty forgiving. When you miss your first bullet or two with a Vandal, well, you pretty much lost that fight, unless your opponent does the same. But with the Phantom, you can get away with it more often than not. Not only because the gun fires more quickly, but more so because it's more accurate, especially after the first few shots. Whiffing is never to be recommended, but if you do whiff a lot, maybe a Phantom is better for you. Something you can also do with the Phantom is strategically shooting before you actually stop moving. The recovery time is quick, and also the movement accuracy isn't nearly as punishing as it is on a Vandal. If you're swinging an angle wide, you can already fire off a couple shots before you come to a full stop. In many cases, especially at a short to medium range, this can actually work even better than peeking normally. And as long as you don't let things get out of hand and start spraying while full sprint fighting someone across the map, it has some real good uses. This extra movement accuracy also means that if your opponents are quite close, running and gunning is surprisingly effective and isn't something you should be shying away from. Of course, moving and shooting isn't a great habit in most situations, but if it's close enough, one could argue that it's even better than standing still. Additionally, holding corners with the Phantom is a lot better than it is with a Vandal. You can carry a spray a lot easier and for longer, and also doing short bursts makes it so that you can force people to eat lead, or simply just not peek. While doing the same thing with the Vandal allows someone to slip in between your burst and peek a lot easier. If you ever get in a situation where you're very committed to an angle and need to find a way to fall back behind cover, having a Phantom would make that a lot easier. Another pretty cool thing that not a lot of people are aware about is that the Phantom doesn't have tracers while the Vandal does. This might seem pretty neglectable, but it actually makes spraying Vandal users through smokes a lot easier than those with the Phantom. This is something to be aware about with both a Vandal and a Phantom. If there's smoke and you have a Vandal, be aware that spraying first can easily get you killed. And if you're using a Phantom, baiting someone with a Vandal to start a spam battle is usually a pretty free kill. Always remember that when using a Phantom, you shouldn't try to battle out a Vandal user at longer ranges, as that's just a bit silly. You're putting yourself at a huge disadvantage, and if you were to take the same fight somewhere else, the roles would be reversed. Of course, this is not something you can always control, but take your gun choice into consideration before the round even starts. And for the most part, you'll be able to have favorable fights all round as long as you can stick to your initial plans. If you do ever get in a situation where you're fighting at longer ranges with the Phantom, just make sure that instead of spraying, you're doing 2 to 3 shot bursts, as you really need to hit 2 headshots in order to guarantee a kill at any range. Spraying at that point will not only make those 2 headshots harder to hit, but also makes it so that you're a sitting duck for whoever you're fighting, just waiting to get killed. So yeah, don't do that. For our last tip, we got some advice specifically for the second round of any half. For one, the Phantom on the second round is even stronger than it is normally as heavy armor is more rare, so the 140 at medium distances will be a one-shot nonetheless. So even on maps or fights where the Phantom might not shine normally, it now suddenly will. But also, more importantly, is the question of should you ever buy it? To answer that, we would say yes, but only in certain scenarios. If you're offering up all of your utility and you're running light shields in order to get away with having a gun in the second round, it's really not worth it. But if you can get a heavy and also a Phantom, in most cases that is, please note that this only happens very rarely though, and requires you to get at least a couple of kills on pistol round. But if that's not a problem for you, and you're able to farm enough cash for the second round, getting that early rifle is pretty darn good. Well guys, that's going to wrap up this guide. We hope you learned a thing or two, and perhaps you are now more confident in when and how you should be using the Phantom. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We love putting out these videos for you guys and can't do it without your support, so it would be greatly appreciated. If you have the time and are passionate about improvement, check out our website ProGuides.com as well. We have some amazing coaches as well as some courses taught directly by the pros, which will really shape you up into the best Valorant player you can possibly be. This has been your host Sergeant Frost, and I will see you all again in the next one.